New survey and study finds that the President Donald Trump is mentally unwell, and everyone around him knows it. Until recently, the debate over our president's mental health has focused on questions of psychological pathology. Do Donald Trump's flamboyant narcissism, hedonism, and self-delusions add up to a malignant personality, or a malignant personality disorder? Scores of psychiatric professionals say the latter. Some of their peers, and a large number of laymen, have insisted that the matter can only be settled by a psychiatrist who has personally, privately evaluated the president. That argument has always struck me as nuts. There is no diagnostic blood test or brain scan for narcissistic personality disorder, there's just a list of observable traits. A mental health professional simply studies a patient's modes of reasoning and patterns of behavior, and assesses whether they fit the checklist of symptoms for NPD. It's absurd to believe that a psychiatrist who has spent a couple of hours talking to a patient in an office is qualified to make this diagnosis, but one with access to hundreds of hours of a patient's interviews and improvisatory remarks, along with a small library's worth of biographical information and testimonials from his closest confidants, is not. To insist otherwise is to mystify psychiatric practice. It's to pretend that there is some shamanistic knowledge that mental health professionals can only access once you provide them with a co-pay. Further, whether we choose to label any given psychological profile a disorder is always, on some level, a value judgment about what it means to function healthily in our society. If an inability to concentrate on tests can qualify one for psychological dysfunction, then it's hard to see why Trump's manifest incapacity to subordinate his hunger for affirmation and attention to basic social norms would not. If a middle school boy displayed Donald Trump's level of impulse control in the classroom, there is little question that he would be considered psychologically unhealthy. Regardless, in recent weeks, concerns about the commander-in-chief's cognition have turned to the more mundane, and objectively determinable, question of neurological decline. The president's slurred speech when announcing his decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the exceptional incoherence of his most recent interview with the New York Times, and increasingly erratic and Freudian tweets all brought our president's frontal lobe to the forefront of public discourse. And then Michael Wolff started telling us what he'd learned while hanging around the West Wing last year. Having won the administration's trust, possibly with the aid of these horrendous, anti-Trump think pieces, the reporter was given extraordinary access to the president's closest advisors. On Thursday in The Hollywood Reporter, he added a few new details to the emerging portrait of our president's mental state. Everybody, in the White House, was painfully aware of the increasing pace of his repetitions. It used to be inside of 30 minutes he'd repeat word for word and expression for expression, the same 3 stories, now it was within 10 minutes. Indeed, many of his tweets were the product of his repetitions, he just couldn't stop saying something. Hoping for the best, with their personal futures as well as the country's future depending on it, my indelible impression of talking to them and observing them through much of the first year of his presidency, is that they all, 100%, came to believe he was incapable of functioning in his job. At Mar-a-Lago, just before the new year, a heavily made-up Trump failed to recognize a succession of old friends. And yet, progressives' fixation on the 25th Amendment is far less diluted than the rationalizations that keep Republicans from invoking it. By all accounts, most GOP Congress members recognize that Donald Trump is a pathological narcissist with early-stage dementia and only peripheral contact with reality, and they have, nonetheless, decided to let him retain unilateral command of the largest nuclear arsenal on planet Earth because it would be politically and personally inconvenient to remove his finger from the button. You don't need a degree in psychiatry to call that crazy.